In the quiet countryside of Wisconsin, there once stood a convent so peaceful that no one questioned it, until decades later, when records revealed something deeply wrong. 23 women entered St. Mary's Convent seeking faith, obedience, and purpose. Only 3 were ever seen again. The rest did not die. They were not sold. They were not buried. They simply vanished. Tonight we uncover the story the Church never explained, and the silence that protected it for more than a century. If stories like this matter to you, stories that were buried, denied, and left to decay in silence, then take a moment now to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear does not reveal its horror quickly, and it does not explain itself kindly. St. Mary's Convent stood on a gentle rise of land outside a growing Wisconsin settlement, its pale limestone walls catching the sun in a way that made it appear almost merciful, almost welcoming, a place where faith seemed solid enough to touch, and in the early 1850s, that illusion was powerful enough to convince families to surrender their daughters to it without hesitation, because frontier life was uncertain, brutal, and unforgiving, and the Church promised structure, purpose, and salvation wrapped in discipline and devotion. Young women arrived at St. Mary's with small trunks, handwritten letters from home, and a belief that obedience would protect them from the chaos of the outside world. And upon crossing the threshold, they were stripped not just of personal belongings, but of identity itself, given new names, new schedules, new rules, and a new silence to learn. The convent records from those early years are meticulous at first, documenting arrivals with ceremonial precision, ages, former parishes, dates of induction, vows spoken under candlelight, but what those records do not capture is the moment the doors closed behind each woman. Because once they did, the world they came from no longer followed them inside. Life at St. Mary's unfolded according to rigid hours marked by bells that rang regardless of weather or season, calling the nuns to prayer before dawn, labor through the day, and reflection at night. And for a time, nothing appeared unusual to the surrounding community. Parishioners attended Mass, donations were accepted, hymns drifted across the fields, and the convent projected stability. But between 1854 and 1862, something subtle and deeply wrong began to take shape beneath that surface, something that did not announce itself with violence or scandal, but with absence. One by one, young nuns stopped appearing at morning prayers, their voices missing from hymns, their seats empty at meals, and when questions were quietly raised, the answers came calmly, confidently, and always the same: transfers, distant missions, divine reassignment. No one questioned these explanations at first, because the Church spoke with authority, and obedience had been trained into both the faithful and the women inside the walls. But patterns do not need witnesses to exist, they only need repetition, and over time it became clear that the convent was not growing despite continued admissions, that the number of nuns never increased, that the rhythm of life inside St. Mary's remained unnervingly fixed, as if the building itself resisted change. Families who wrote letters to their daughters received no replies, and were told such correspondence was discouraged during spiritual adjustment, a phrase that appeared again and again in official responses, and when years passed with no word, grief had nowhere to settle, because there was no death to mourn, no grave to visit, only silence sanctioned by faith. Locals began to notice details they could not quite explain: the bell ringing at irregular hours, long after evening prayers should have ended, lights glowing faintly in sections of the convent that were supposedly unused, deliveries arriving late at night and disappearing before morning. But these observations were shared only in whispers, because to speak openly was to risk being accused of suspicion, or worse, heresy. The convent's leadership, 3 senior nuns whose names appeared repeatedly in financial and correspondence records, became the sole visible presence of St. Mary's to the outside world, handling visits, donations, and communication with church authorities, always composed, always consistent, always deflecting inquiry with gentle authority. Meanwhile, inside the walls, younger nuns learned quickly that questions were not encouraged. that obedience was not merely expected, but enforced through isolation, silence, and fear of spiritual failure, and so the disappearances continued, quietly, efficiently, without struggle or resistance, as if the convent itself had learned how to erase people without leaving marks. What makes this beginning so unsettling is not what we know, but how little was recorded. No disciplinary logs, no illness outbreaks, no burial entries, no transfers confirmed by receiving institutions, only gaps where names once existed, gaps that widened over time until even memory struggled to hold them. By the end of the 1850s, 23 women had entered St. Mary's Convent, yet only 3 remained visible within its records, their presence unchanged, their authority unquestioned, their silence complete, and as the doors continued to close behind each new arrival, no one outside realized that they were not opening again in the same way, because the convent did not need force to hide what it was doing. It only needed patience, obedience, and time. By the time the pattern of disappearance had quietly settled into the daily rhythm of St. Mary's Convent, the building itself had begun to change in ways that were never spoken of aloud, but were felt instinctively by those who lived within its walls, because places, like people, absorb what happens inside them, and the convent slowly developed a geography of fear that did not appear on any floor plan. New arrivals were given careful tours that followed the same narrow paths: chapel, dormitory, refectory, garden, and certain corridors were never mentioned at all, most notably the north wing, a long stretch of stone rooms sealed behind a heavy door that remained locked regardless of season or need. When asked, senior sisters explained that the wing was structurally unsound, closed off after early construction flaws, yet no repairs were ever scheduled, no masons summoned, no inspections recorded, and the explanation itself began to sound rehearsed, as if repetition had worn away its meaning. The younger nuns learned quickly that curiosity was a liability, that silence was rewarded, and that those who asked too many questions found themselves assigned to isolated duties: laundry rooms below ground, night vigils alone in unheated chapels, hours of penance without explanation, disciplines framed as spiritual correction but experienced as quiet punishment. Over time, the disappearances ceased to be shocking and instead became something more dangerous, normalized, folded into the language of devotion, explained away as part of a sacred journey no one was allowed to witness. Yet, normalization does not erase fear, it only drives it inward, and many of the women began to sense that St. Mary's was not merely a place of withdrawal from the world, but a place where the world itself had been rearranged according to rules no one fully understood. At night, sounds traveled strangely through the stone corridors, footsteps that echoed where no one should be walking, murmured voices that stopped abruptly when doors opened, the dull scrape of something heavy being moved across floors at hours when all were meant to be at rest, and these sounds were never acknowledged during daylight, as if speaking them would make them real in a way that prayer could not undo. The convent's routines grew increasingly rigid, with bells rung tea slightly altered times, meals shortened, communal prayers reduced, and individual confession emphasized, creating a structure where isolation replaced fellowship and secrecy replaced trust. Records from the period show a curious shift as well. While financial ledgers remained precise, noting donations, purchases, and repairs with careful detail, personal records became sparse, reduced to initials rather than full names, dates without context, annotations that referred to reassignments without destinations, and eventually entire pages left blank except for the convent seal. It was during this period that the 3 senior nuns, women whose authority seemed to extend beyond ordinary ecclesiastical hierarchy, tightened their control, presenting themselves as spiritual guardians not only of the convent but of truth itself, deciding which questions were permitted and which were sinful. Visitors from the church hierarchy arrived occasionally, but their stays were brief, carefully managed, confined to public spaces, and always accompanied, and any irregularities were smoothed over with appeals to frontier hardship and the challenges of maintaining discipline among young, fragile souls. Outside the walls, the settlement continued to grow, unaware that the convent had begun to function as a closed system, one that absorbed people without returning them, and inside, the younger nuns began to understand that obedience was no longer simply a vow but a survival strategy. Some attempted to document what they witnessed in private journals, hiding scraps of writing beneath floorboards or inside prayer books, but these efforts were risky because inspections were frequent and punishment swift, and several journals recovered decades later end abruptly mid-sentence, their authors never identified again in any official capacity. The north wing loomed larger in these fragmented accounts than any other feature of the convent, described as unnaturally cold even in summer, perpetually dark, and accompanied by a smell that did not belong to stone or age, but to something organic, something wrong. On certain nights the locked door at the end of the main corridor was said to be opened briefly, guarded, and then sealed again before dawn, and those assigned to nearby duties reported hearing chanting unlike any prayers they recognized, words spoken too softly to understand, yet too rhythmically to dismiss as coincidence. The most unsettling detail, repeated across several independent accounts, was that the disappearances often followed these nights, as if something had been decided behind that door and then carried out quietly afterward. By the early 1860s, fear had become so deeply embedded in the convent structure that even hope felt dangerous, because hope suggested the possibility of escape, and escape was not something anyone had ever seen succeed. Letters smuggled out through sympathetic laborers were intercepted or ignored. Families who arrived unannounced were turned away with solemn assurances, and the local clergy, whether complicit or simply unwilling to challenge authority, continued to defend the institution publicly. What makes this phase of the story particularly chilling is that no single act stands out as the moment everything went wrong. Instead, the horror accumulated gradually, through routine, through faith weaponized into silence, through the quiet understanding that once someone vanished, they were never spoken of again, not as a cautionary tale, not as a tragedy, but as if they had never existed at all. The convent did not need to hide bodies in this stage, it hid questions, and in doing so, it created an environment where disappearance itself became invisible, where absence was reframed as obedience, and where the locked north wing became not just a physical space, but a symbol of how completely control had been sealed, because by the time anyone outside began to suspect that something was truly wrong at St. Mary's, the mechanisms of concealment were already perfected, and whatever waited behind that unopened door had been waiting a very long time. By the time the north wing had transformed from a locked corridor into an unspoken boundary of fear, the younger nuns of St. Mary's began to understand that survival depended not on faith alone, but on memory, on quietly holding on to details before they were stripped away, because the convent did not only erase bodies, it erased narratives, and those who forgot too completely seemed to disappear the fastest. The women who arrived during this period were younger than those before them, many barely past adolescence, drawn from poor frontier families who believed the convent would offer safety, education, and divine purpose. And these girls entered with minds still flexible enough to notice contradictions, still untrained in the discipline of selective blindness. They noticed how the convent never truly slept, how footsteps echoed during hours of supposed silence, how the bells sometimes rang without human hands, and how certain senior sisters seemed to know when someone was thinking about leaving before a word was spoken. These girls also noticed something more subtle, more terrifying, the way names vanished first. A nun who had shared a sleeping pallet one night would be referred to the next morning only as she, then not referred to at all, her cup removed from the refectory, her bedding folded away, her labor reassigned without explanation, as if the act of not naming her was the final step in her erasure. Several of the younger women made a quiet pact among themselves, not formal, not spoken openly, but practiced in glances and gestures, agreeing to remember one another's real names, their family origins, their stories from before the convent, as if holding those details might anchor them to existence. They whispered these names during prayers when lips moved but voices did not, threading memory into devotion in a way that felt both rebellious and sacred. It was during this fragile period of resistance that the convent's internal discipline intensified, suggesting that someone in authority had noticed the shift because punishments became less corrective and more preventive, designed not to respond to disobedience but to preempt it. The girls were separated more frequently, assigned to solitary work, rotated through sleeping quarters, denied consistent routines that might allow bonds to deepen, and this deliberate fragmentation mirrored the convent's architectural design, corridors branching into dead ends, staircases leading nowhere, doors that opened only from one side. The north wing continued to dominate their nightmares, even for those who had never seen inside it, because fear does not require evidence when imagination is fed by silence, and the girls began to sense that whatever happened there was not merely disciplinary but ceremonial, something repeated with purpose rather than necessity. On nights when the wing was opened, the atmosphere of the entire convent shifted, as if the walls themselves were listening, and the girls reported sensations that defied explanation. Pressure in the ears, sudden nausea, an overwhelming urge to pray without knowing why, as though something unseen was demanding attention. One of the girls, whose journal would later become a crucial fragment of evidence, described feeling as though the convent was holding its breath during those nights, waiting for something to be completed before exhaling again. These journals, written in cramped handwriting and hidden with increasing desperation, reveal an environment where fear was no longer a response to danger but the air itself, constant and inescapable, shaping thought and behavior until even resistance felt futile. The girls wrote of senior sisters whose demeanor shifted after nights near the north wing, emerging pale, withdrawn, and marked by a severity that bordered on reverence, as if they had witnessed something they believed must be protected at all costs. They also wrote of a doctor who visited irregularly, always after dusk, never announced, escorted directly to restricted areas, his presence explained away as tending to illnesses no one was ever allowed to see, and his departure followed invariably by the disappearance of another young woman. This doctor became a figure of whispered terror, not because of what he did openly, but because of what his arrival signaled, a prelude to absence that the girls learned to dread more than punishment itself. Attempts to alert the outside world grew more desperate and more dangerous. Scraps of cloth marked with names were sewn into laundry sent out for washing, coded messages were hidden in embroidery, prayers were altered subtly in ways only family members might recognize, but these efforts rarely succeeded, intercepted by the convent's tight control over movement and communication. When one girl attempted to flee outright, slipping away during a storm, her absence was discovered before dawn, and by the following evening, the entire convent was gathered for a sermon on obedience so severe that several witnesses later described it as a warning disguised as scripture, delivered not to guide but to terrify. After that night, the girl was never mentioned again, and her attempted escape was erased so thoroughly that even those who had helped her began to doubt their own memories, questioning whether they had imagined her existence at all. This erosion of certainty was perhaps the convent's most effective weapon, because when reality itself becomes unstable, resistance loses its footing, and the girls found themselves clinging to fragments, faces, voices, half-remembered laughter as proof that they were not alone, that something real was being lost. By the time outside suspicion finally began to form, sparked by an unusual concentration of unanswered letters and a traveling priest's unease, the internal community of remembrance had already been decimated, its members scattered, silenced, or gone, leaving behind only their hidden writings and the heavy sense that St. Mary's had been designed not simply to contain women, but to unmake them, layer by layer, until nothing remained that could testify against it. The horror of this phase does not lie in a single revelation, but in the slow realization that the convent's greatest cruelty was its patience, its willingness to wait until fear did its work thoroughly, until even the girls who tried to remember began to feel as though remembering was a sin, and as the doors of the north wing continued to open and close in the dead of night, the convent moved steadily closer to a moment when silence would no longer be enough to protect it, because somewhere beyond its walls, questions were finally beginning to form. The first true threat to St. Mary's Convent did not arrive in the form of outrage or accusation, but as hesitation, a subtle shift in tone that crept into correspondence from church officials who had, until then, accepted every explanation without resistance, because institutions rarely react to single complaints, but they do respond when silence becomes statistically strange. By the early 1860s, the number of unresolved inquiries from families had grown too large to ignore completely, letters arriving not in isolation but in clusters, all asking the same restrained questions about daughters who had supposedly been transferred yet never arrived anywhere else, and it was this accumulation, rather than any one allegation, that forced the diocese to act. A preliminary inquiry was announced quietly, framed not as an investigation but as a routine visitation, a language choice that immediately signaled its limitations, because the goal was never to uncover wrongdoing, only to confirm that nothing improper could be proven. When the visiting cleric arrived, he was received with warmth and ceremony, guided carefully through approved spaces, shown spotless dormiter. Yes, orderly ledgers, and a chapel glowing with devotional excess, and every answer he received was polished by repetition, every pause filled with scripture. Yet even within these constraints, unease crept in, because the convent did not behave like a place accustomed to scrutiny, it behaved like a place prepared for it, anticipating questions before they were asked, offering explanations too quickly, directing attention away from certain topics with practiced ease. The cleric noted, privately at first, the absence of younger nuns relative to the convent's reported admissions, the lack of correspondence confirming transfers, and the oddly centralized authority held by the same 3 senior sisters whose names appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. When he requested access to full records, he was provided with summaries rather than originals, and when he asked to inspect the entire building, he was gently but firmly discouraged from entering the north wing, again citing structural instability, a claim unsupported by any visible damage. It was here that the investigation reached its first quiet impasse, because without overt defiance, the convent had learned how to say no politely, how to delay without refusing, and how to cloak obstruction in humility. The cleric departed with concerns but no proof, and for a brief time it appeared that St. Mary's would survive scrutiny as it had survived everything else, through patience, confidence, and the Church's deep reluctance to expose itself to scandal. But doubt, once introduced, does not always retreat, and within months, a second inquiry was initiated, this time involving civil authorities under the pretext of resolving estate matters linked to donations made on behalf of missing women. This shift changed the nature of the threat entirely, because while the Church could shield itself internally, civil law demanded documentation that prayer could not replace. Notices were sent, meetings scheduled, and for the first time, the convent's leadership faced questions that could not be answered with scripture alone. As officials reviewed land records and financial accounts, they discovered inconsistencies, assets attributed to women who no longer existed on any roster, donations made in names that had no living representatives, and expenditures allocated to areas of the building that were supposedly closed and unused. These discrepancies did not yet prove murder or abuse, but they proved something harder to dismiss: deception. Tension within the convent escalated rapidly, sensed by the remaining nuns as an almost physical pressure. Routines tightened further, movements restricted, and any discussion of the inquiries framed as spiritual attacks meant to test faith. The north wing was sealed more completely than ever, guarded at night, its door reinforced, as if the building itself were bracing for impact. When inspectors finally arrived with legal authority to conduct a full search, they were met not with resistance, but with delay. Meetings postponed due to illness, keys temporarily misplaced, rooms inexplicably locked from the inside, and it was during these delays that crucial evidence was likely moved, altered, or destroyed. Still, time works against secrecy eventually, and on the third day of inspection, inspectors gained access to the lower levels beneath the convent, areas previously described as storage and utility space, and there, the carefully maintained image of St. Mary's began to fracture. They found rooms that did not appear on any plan, chambers with drainage systems inconsistent with domestic use, tools stored with a precision that suggested regular application, and traces, stains, residues, structural modifications that raised questions no explanation could fully answer. Most disturbing were the records discovered hidden behind false walls and beneath floorboards, fragments of journals, lists of names written and crossed out, schedules that aligned eerily with known disappear, rances and coded references to preparations and completions that bore no resemblance to any recognized religious practice. As these findings accumulated, the investigation shifted from reluctant oversight to urgent inquiry, and the convent's leadership responded not with confession but with withdrawal, retreating into silence, prayer, and appeals to ecclesiastical authority that no longer held absolute sway. When the north wing was finally breached, its door opened under supervision rather than ritual, the space revealed within was not dramatic in the way rumors had imagined, but methodical, stripped of ornament, designed for function rather than spectacle, and this very ordinariness made it more horrifying, because it suggested intention rather than impulse. What investigators found there would later be contested, reinterpreted, and partially erased from official reports, but contemporary notes describe evidence of prolonged confinement, medical intervention, and disposal practices inconsistent with any legitimate care, all pointing toward a system that had operated for years without interruption. Before arrests could be made or full testimonies gathered, church authorities intervened decisively, asserting jurisdiction, removing key figures, sealing records, and negotiating a resolution that prioritized institutional preservation over transparency. The investigation was halted before it could conclude, its findings fragmented, its conclusions softened, and its most damning details buried under layers of procedural language, leaving behind a story that could not be fully told but could no longer be entirely silenced. And so St. Mary's Convent did not fall with a single revelation or dramatic reckoning. Instead, it entered a liminal state between exposure and denial, its doors eventually closed, its inhabitants dispersed, its history rewritten as a tragic misunderstanding rather than a deliberate atrocity, and yet, despite every effort to contain it, the investigation had done one irreversible thing. It had broken the spell of unquestioned obedience, allowing the possibility, however fragile, that the women who vanished had not simply been transferred but taken, and that the convent's silence had been carefully, catastrophically constructed. After the investigation was abruptly curtailed and authority over St. Mary's quietly shifted back into ecclesiastical hands, the official narrative began to harden almost immediately, not through bold declarations but through omission, revision, and the careful smoothing of language. Because institutions rarely erase history outright, they soften it until it no longer cuts. Reports were rewritten to emphasize procedural confusion rather than misconduct, inconsistencies were reframed as clerical errors, and entire sections detailing discoveries beneath the convent were removed or relegated to appendices marked confidential, effectively sealing them away from public scrutiny. Yet even as records vanished from archives and testimonies were discouraged, the physical reality of what had been uncovered could not be undone so easily, because stone remembers, and those who had entered the lower chambers carried those memories with them, unable to reconcile what they had seen with the peaceful facade that had defined St. Mary's for so long. In the weeks following the closure, workers tasked with decommissioning the convent reported finding remnants that did not appear in any inventory. Personal effects without owners, fragments of clothing hidden within walls, prayer beads worn smooth by hands that no longer existed to claim them, and these discoveries, though dismissed officially as misplaced property, circulated through the community in whispers that grew more insistent with each retelling. The land itself seemed unwilling to cooperate with the effort to forget, as sections of the garden began to sink inexplicably, revealing disturbed soil patterns inconsistent with landscaping records, and when repairs were attempted, laborers unearthed layers of material that suggested repeated excavation and concealment over many years. These findings were reported, then retracted, then quietly handled without documentation, reinforcing the sense that whatever had happened at St. Mary's was being deliberately absorbed into silence rather than resolved. Former nuns, dispersed to distant institutions or returned abruptly to secular life, struggled to speak about their experiences, not only because of fear, but because their memories no longer aligned neatly with the revised official story, creating a dissonance that left many doubting themselves, questioning whether what they remembered could truly have occurred. Some attempted to give testimony anonymously, submitting letters to local papers or church authorities, but these accounts were dismissed as hysteria, spiritual confusion, or malicious invention, a familiar strategy that reframed trauma as instability and ensured that credibility remained safely centralized. Yet fragments persisted, refusing to disappear entirely, preserved in private collections, family attics, and the margins of unrelated documents where names appeared unexpectedly, followed by annotations like status unresolved or reassignment unconfirmed. One particularly disturbing ledger, discovered decades later among estate papers, listed expenditures for medical supplies and containment equipment far exceeding any reasonable need for a convent of its size, suggesting not isolated incidents but sustained operation, a system designed to function continuously and without interruption. Oral histories collected generations later echoed similar themes despite geographical separation. Former residents describing the same rooms, the same routines, the same sense of being watched even in prayer, their accounts aligning in detail despite never having been shared publicly before. What emerges from these overlapping fragments is not a clear sequence of events, but a pattern, a structure of behavior that prioritized control over care, secrecy over salvation, and preservation of authority above all else. The sealed records did not end the story. They merely shifted it into a different register, one where truth existed not in official conclusions, but in the negative space around them, in the unanswered questions that continued to surface whenever St. Mary's was mentioned. Attempts to repurpose the property failed repeatedly, buyers withdrawing after encountering unexplained obstacles, construction halted by structural anomalies no one could fully explain, as if the building itself resisted reuse, unwilling to be transformed into something innocuous. Locals began referring to the site obliquely, avoiding its name, describing it instead by location or former function, a linguistic distancing that mirrored the broader effort to contain its legacy without confronting it. Meanwhile, church authorities maintained a posture of quiet finality, insisting the matter had been resolved satisfactorily, that any suffering was regrettable but unproven, and that continued speculation served no purpose but division. This insistence on closure, however, only deepened suspicion, because closure without transparency feels less like healing and more like concealment, and the absence of accountability left a vacuum where darker interpretations thrived. Over time, the number 23 began to circulate independently of the convent's name, appearing in sermons, folk songs, and whispered warnings, detached from its origin, yet heavy with implication, a numerical ghost that hinted at loss without naming it. The three women who had remained visible throughout the convent's operation faded into obscurity, their later lives sparsely documented, protected by layers of discretion that ensured no definitive reckoning would ever occur, and this lack of resolution became one of the story's most unsettling aspects, because it denied the comfort of justice while preserving the weight of harm. In the end, what survived was not a confession or a verdict, but an accumulation of evidence too substantial to dismiss yet too fragmented to prosecute, leaving St. Mary's suspended between myth and history, its horrors neither fully proven nor fully erased. And as years turned into decades, the question shifted from what exactly happened behind those walls to why so many were willing to let the answer remain incomplete, why silence was chosen repeatedly over certainty. The sealing of records did not protect the truth, it preserved it in a distorted form, one that demanded interpretation rather than acceptance, and this distortion ensured that the story of the vanished nuns would continue to resurface, reshaped by each generation that encountered its fragments and felt, instinctively, that something essential had been taken and never returned. Even after the convent gates were locked for the final time, and St. Mary's slipped into official dormancy, the story did not end for those who survived it, because survival in this case did not mean freedom. It meant carrying something unfinished into the rest of their lives, something that could not be spoken plainly without consequence. The women who emerged from St. Mary's were not released so much as redistributed, quietly transferred to other institutions, parishes, or distant relatives, their departures framed as reassignment rather than escape, and each was bound by layers of vows, warnings, and unspoken threats that made testimony feel dangerous even outside the convent's walls. Many were still young, ill-prepared for a world that had moved on without them, and they found that whatever they had endured inside St. Mary's did not translate into language others could accept, because when they tried to explain, their stories sounded unbelievable, fragmented, too dark to reconcile with the public image of religious devotion. Some were advised gently to pray more and speak less. Others were told outright that revisiting such memories was a temptation of pride or delusion, and over time, many learned that silence was the only path that allowed them to function at all. Yet silence does not erase memory, it merely buries it, and buried memories have a way of surfacing unexpectedly, in dreams, in moments of prayer, in the echo of bells that rang too sharply, too suddenly, too much like those that once controlled every hour of their lives. Several survivors left religious life entirely, marrying, raising families, attempting to construct ordinary futures, but even in domestic spaces, they reported sensations that felt disturbingly familiar. Locked doors provoking panic, nighttime footsteps triggering dread, the smell of stone and damp air returning without warning, suggesting that the convent had embedded itself not just in their past, but in their nervous systems. Others remained within the church, believing that staying close to the structure might somehow protect them. Yet these women often drifted between postings, never settling, their records marked by vague notes about fragility or spiritual sensitivity, labels that justified marginalization while obscuring cause. When historians later attempted to track these women, they found trails that ended abruptly, names altered or replaced, identities blurred by institutional bureaucracy that seemed designed to dissolve continuity, and this bureaucratic erasure functioned as a secondary disappearance, quieter but no less final. In private moments, some survivors wrote letters they never sent, addressed to vanished sisters whose fates they could only guess, apologizing for surviving, for forgetting details, for failing to resist more openly, and these unsent letters, discovered long after their authors' deaths, reveal the depth of guilt that accompanied survival, a guilt cultivated by a system that framed endurance as complicity. The Church's refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing publicly placed an additional burden on these women, because without validation, trauma turns inward, and many began to question whether their memories were accurate at all, whether fear had distorted perception, whether the horrors they recalled were exaggerations born of stress. And this self-doubt was perhaps the most enduring damage inflicted by St. Mary's, because it severed survivors from their own authority over truth. Meanwhile, the broader community absorbed a softened version of events, one that emphasized misunderstanding rather than malice, and this narrative provided comfort not only to the institution but to the public, because accepting that something truly monstrous had occurred would require acknowledging collective failure, the failure to ask harder questions, to listen more closely, to challenge authority when something felt wrong. Survivors sensed this resistance whenever they hinted at what they had lived through, recognizing that disbelief was not always rooted in skepticism, but in fear of what belief would demand. Some attempted to speak decades later, when distance from the events seemed to offer safety, but by then, witnesses were gone, records sealed, and the urgency had faded, leaving their testimonies suspended in a space where they could be acknowledged politely, but not acted upon. The irony is that many of these women remained deeply faithful, not because the Church had earned their trust, but because faith itself had become the only framework through which they could interpret what they had survived, and so they prayed not for justice, but for endurance, not for exposure, but for peace. Yet even this spiritual resilience carried cost, because it required compartmentalizing anger, grief, and betrayal in ways that fractured identity, and several accounts describe a sense of living divided lives, one outwardly composed and devout, the other perpetually haunted by unanswered questions. As years passed, the survivors aged, and with age came a loosening of fear, a sense that whatever power had once controlled them no longer held the same reach, and a few began to speak more openly within trusted circles, their stories aligning in unexpected ways, reinforcing one another's memories, and confirming that what they had experienced was not illusion but pattern. These late-life testimonies, though rarely recorded formally, form a crucial undercurrent in the history of St. Mary's because they demonstrate that survival did not equate to forgetting, and that the convent's influence extended far beyond its physical closure, shaping lives quietly and persistently. What emerges from listening to these survivors is not a narrative of triumph, but of endurance under erasure, a reminder that harm does not require spectacle to be devastating, and that the most lasting wounds are often inflicted not by overt violence, but by systems that deny recognition, leaving those who lived through them trapped between memory and silence. In this sense, St. Mary's never truly released its hold on the women who entered it, because even as they moved through the world, the convent remained present as an unresolved chapter, a shadow that followed them into old age, whispering that what happened mattered, even if no one ever said so aloud. As the survivors aged and the last living witnesses drifted further from the center of public attention, time itself became the next force to test St. Mary's, because while institutions can seal records and redirect narratives, they cannot indefinitely preserve physical spaces from decay, and it was this slow, indifferent erosion that eventually reopened questions no authority had ever fully answered. Decades after the convent's closure, the property passed through a succession of custodians who approached it not as a sacred site, but as a liability, each attempting in turn to sell, renovate, or repurpose the land, and each discovering that St. Mary's resisted such efforts in ways that felt less supernatural than structural, as if the building had been engineered to conceal rather than accommodate. Surveyors mapping the grounds encountered inconsistencies between official blueprints and what existed beneath the surface, measurements that did not align, rooms that appeared where none should have been, and foundations reinforced far beyond what the modest structure would have required, suggesting a history of construction motivated by secrecy rather than stability. When exploratory work began in earnest, prompted by plans to convert the site into a civic facility, crews uncovered sealed passageways and sublevels that had never been documented, their entrances concealed behind layers of stonework so expertly blended that they could only be detected through irregularities in airflow and temperature. These discoveries reignited local unease, not as sudden panic but as recognition, because many in the community had grown up hearing fragments of the story, warnings delivered without context, and now the physical evidence seemed to be catching up with the whispers. Work was halted repeatedly as each new finding required assessment, and with every delay, pressure mounted from those who argued that disturbing the site served no purpose, that reopening old wounds would only harm reputations and unsettle faith. Yet the very resistance to exploration became its own indictment, because it echoed the same patterns that had allowed the convent to operate unchecked in the first place: the instinct to prioritize order over truth, to avoid discomfort rather than confront it. When historians and independent researchers were finally granted limited access, they approached the site cautiously, aware that decades of neglect and intentional alteration had compromised much of what might once have been clear, but even so, the material they documented was enough to confirm that St. Mary's had never been a simple convent. They found evidence of repeated modifications made over time rather than all at once, suggesting an evolving system, one that adapted in response to internal and external pressures, and this adaptability reinforced the conclusion that what occurred there was not accidental or isolated, but sustained through deliberate choice. Soil analysis revealed disturbances consistent with multiple layering events, not the singular digging of graves but cycles of concealment and reworking. And though no intact remains were recovered at this stage, the absence itself was telling, pointing toward removal rather than innocence. Objects recovered from these spaces, buttons, fragments of fabric, personal tokens, were catalogued with care, their ordinariness underscoring the humanity of those who had once owned them, and for many observers, this was the moment when abstraction collapsed, when the story ceased to be about institutions and became instead about individuals who had lived and vanished. Predictably, debates followed, with church representatives reiterating long-standing positions, emphasizing the lack of definitive proof and warning against speculative interpretation, while others argued that the cumulative weight of evidence, though incomplete, demanded acknowledgement. The community found itself divided not between belief and disbelief, but between those who felt the past should remain sealed for the sake of cohesion and those who believed cohesion built on silence was inherently fragile. As public interest grew, so did attempts to contextualize St. Mary's within a broader pattern of institutional abuse, drawing parallels not to sensationalize but to illustrate that what had happened there was not unimaginable, that similar dynamics had surfaced elsewhere when power went unchallenged and accountability was deferred. This reframing shifted the conversation away from whether St. Mary's was uniquely monstrous and toward how ordinary structures can become dangerous when insulated from scrutiny. And this shift unsettled many because it implicated not just a place or a few individuals, but a way of thinking that valued order over inquiry. Memorial proposals emerged, modest at first, suggesting plaques or markers to acknowledge the missing women, but these efforts stalled repeatedly, mired in debates over language, responsibility and jurisdiction, revealing how even remembrance can become contested when truth remains incomplete. Meanwhile, independent scholars continued their work, piecing together timelines from disparate sources, cross-referencing names found in convent records with census data, parish registries and burial logs, and, while definitive conclusions remained elusive, patterns emerged that reinforced earlier suspicions. Women listed as transferred never appeared elsewhere, deaths recorded without corresponding burial sites, and financial transactions that aligned too precisely with periods of disappearance to be dismissed as coincidence. As these findings circulated, St. Mary's shifted again, this time from a localized mystery to a case study cited in broader discussions about transparency, faith, and historical accountability, its significance extending beyond Wisconsin to challenge assumptions about how religious institutions interact with oversight. Yet even as analysis expanded, the emotional core of the story remained stubbornly intact, anchored in the knowledge that whatever had happened, it had happened to real people whose voices had been systematically removed. Visitors to the site, now partially stabilized but never fully restored, reported a sense of heaviness not as a paranormal phenomenon, but as a psychological response to unresolved history, an awareness that the space resisted neutral interpretation, that it demanded engagement rather than passive observation. The walls, weathered and scarred, bore traces of their past not through dramatic symbols, but through subtle irregularities, and standing among them, it became clear that time had not erased St. Mary's. It had merely stripped away the protective layers of authority that once shielded it from examination. In this stage of the story, the question was no longer whether something terrible had occurred, but whether society was prepared to accept that certainty is not always available, that accountability sometimes arrives incomplete, and that acknowledging harm does not require perfect evidence, only the courage to listen to what remains. As debates continued, and the site awaited a final decision about its future, St. Mary's existed in a suspended state, neither fully condemned nor redeemed, its legacy still unfolding, shaped not by what could be conclusively proven, but by how willing people were to confront the discomfort of a past that refused to stay buried. As St. Mary's lingered in that unresolved state, no longer fully protected by reverence yet never wholly surrendered to truth, the final transformation of the convent did not come through excavation or confession, but through memory, because what time ultimately stripped away was not stone or records, but the ability to pretend that forgetting was neutral. The debate over the site's future stretched on for years, exhausting committees and legal channels until the arguments themselves began to feel like echoes of the same deflection that had once allowed the disappearances to proceed unnoticed, and in that exhaustion a quiet consensus emerged among the wider public. Even if absolute answers would never surface, the story itself had earned permanence. It was during this period that St. Mary's ceased to function as a physical mystery alone and became something more unsettling, a symbol of how institutions can outlive the people they fail, carrying forward sanitized narratives while the unresolved pain settles elsewhere, passed from generation to generation like an inherited unease. Descendants of families once connected to the convent began speaking publicly, not with accusations, but with uncertainty, describing how their grandparents avoided certain topics, how letters had been destroyed, how sudden relocations were never explained, and these testimonies, fragmented and imperfect, formed a human counterweight to official silence. The absence of definitive proof no longer weakened the story. Instead, it mirrored the lived experience of those who had suspected wrongdoing but lacked the power to articulate it, reinforcing the idea that truth does not always arrive as revelation, but as accumulation. Eventually, under mounting pressure, the land was designated as a restricted historical site rather than redeveloped property, a compromise that satisfied no one completely but acknowledged that erasure was no longer acceptable. Informational markers were installed, carefully worded, their language cautious yet unmistakable, referring to unaccounted members, sealed records, and ongoing historical inquiry. And while critics dismissed them as inadequate, others saw them as a breach in the wall, the first official admission that St. Mary's story had never been resolved. Visitors began arriving not as thrill-seekers but as witnesses, moving through the remains with a subdued attentiveness, reading between lines, sensing that what mattered most was not what could be proven, but what had been systematically avoided. Scholars continued to revisit the case, integrating it into broader analyses of 19th-century religious authority, gendered obedience, and frontier isolation, arguing that the convent structure, both physical and ideological, had created a closed system in which abuse could persist without detection, and this reframing shifted blame away from monstrous individuals toward mechanisms that reward silence and punish dissent. For many, this was the most disturbing conclusion of all, because it suggested that St. Mary's was not an anomaly, but an extreme example of a pattern repeated wherever power operates without transparency. In time, the convent's name entered academic texts, documentaries, and oral histories, each retelling reshaping the narrative slightly, not diluting it, but expanding it, ensuring that the women who disappeared were no longer confined to footnotes or speculation. Their absence became presence, not through recovery of remains or confessions, but through the refusal to let their erasure remain unquestioned. The Church, for its part, maintained its position, issuing statements that emphasized modern reforms and distancing contemporary leadership from historical events. And while these declarations satisfied some, others recognized them as another iteration of containment, an effort to control interpretation rather than engage with accountability. Yet the power dynamics had shifted, because St. Mary's was no longer an isolated structure under ecclesiastical control. It had become a shared cultural memory, accessible, examinable, and resistant to closure. The final irony was that the convent, once designed to enforce obedience and silence, now functioned as a warning, its ruins speaking more loudly than its walls ever had when intact. Standing before them, one could not escape the sense that the true horror of St. Mary's did not lie in a single hidden room or dark ritual, but in how easily ordinary people accepted explanations that required no evidence, how readily communities trusted authority over intuition, and how long it took for doubt to be considered valid. The unanswered questions remained: what precisely happened behind the locked north wing, who authorized the disappearances, how many lives were lost? But these uncertainties no longer weakened the story, they defined it, reminding us that history is often shaped not by what is known, but by what is deliberately obscured. As the site settled into its final identity, not as a convent, not as a crime scene, but as a testament, the lesson it offered was unsettlingly simple. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of control, and when it endures long enough, it becomes indistinguishable from truth. And so, as you reach the end of this story, standing metaphorically before the remains of St. Mary's, the question is no longer whether you believe every detail, but whether you recognize the pattern, because places like this do not rely on superstition to endure, only on human willingness to look away. If this story held you, disturbed you, or made you question what lies behind respectable walls, make sure to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss what history tried to bury, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story affected you, because as long as these stories are told, the silence never fully wins.